I'm gonna start doing more things like early because I usually just do stuff like by myself or I have conversations
Mm.
with people. And I was thinking like, yeah, well, make this make okay. All right. So the thing is, so this week's Torah portion is very unique from the standpoint that it's basically the end of the book of Exodus, right? And we were learning last night, if you remember. No, we didn't. I wasn't with you guys. So I was learning yesterday, Rabbi Sachs, Chief Rabbi, Chief Lord Rabbi Sachs, and blessed memory. And anyways, and so one of the things that he brings out is that towards the end, at the end of this Torah portion, it is it's the finishing of the creation of the Mishkan, right? And he says he contrasts the language inside the Pasukim with the same language that's used at the end or the beginning of the book of Genesis, right? And he basically shows how the dynamic of creating the Mishkan was in reflection of building building the of the concept of the creation of the world, right? So the Mishkan is like, you know what? Actually, let's see if we could maybe learn it inside for a second, do it some justice before we get into this other point. You know what? I don't want to make such a thing about it. All right. Anyway, but why am I making that an issue right now? Right. I'm making it an issue because the whole point of what we're going to study, which is basically, the kind of like the idea of the methodology of halakha, right? Like the system of halakha is is creating is that ability to kind of like create like the creator, right? Like if we're saying that the world started off in 7 days and God shows us this massive creation, right? He shows us this massive creation, this whole world that he creates, right? And then at the end of the book of Exodus, right? He shows us man's ability to create like God, right? So that means that, or we could learn that between Genesis and Exodus, we're learning how to create like God, right? We're learning how to create the reality. Now, we say, well, what do you mean? I can't create the heavens and the stars and these things. Of course not. But you could build a Mishkan. And if you could build a Mishkan, that means that you were able to create something that God's presence was able to dwell in. God created a world that his presence can dwell in, right? So the idea is saying like this is the dynamic of the human potential of creation, right? And so one of the methodologies of creating reality or creating like God is to have precise measurements, right? Which is a mechanism of how the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was built, right? Was through this dynamic of precise direction given to us by Moses. Moses received from the Creator. So when we learn halachah, that is precise measurements with action and directives that are given to us by Moses, that were given to him by God, right? Now, did Moshe build the tabernacle and all of his dynamics? No, Beit Hillel did, right? And the other guy starts with I can't think of his name right now. God forgive me. But the point is saying like that they created, they articulated this wisdom, right, to build the Mishkan. These are our sages. These are our leaders in every generation. They teach us how to create like God, right? And so the system of learning that process is the halakha. It's a little bit dry, but it's not. If it's about creating reality, if it's about following rules, okay, fine. It's like a legal book. It's about a bunch of laws. All right, very nice. These are the ancient laws of God, so I'm going to follow them. Okay, very nice. You're dedicated. But perhaps we're saying something greater. Maybe we're saying that, hey, you know what? Yeah, for sure, the ancient laws of God, but they give us the ability to create reality. And so it's not about laws. This is about systems of creation, how creation works. It's like you see Star Wars and they both have these lightsabers, right? That's it. Okay, so let's um let's go into this. So this is Rabbi Yehuda David Blick. He's a Rav in America, and he has a lot of his writings. He's a profound writer. But this is kind of like an introductory to the methodology of halacha, right? And this is like when you see these people writing, you read the Shulchan Aruch, you say, well, what do we do, Rob? What do we do for this holiday? We do this, do this. Like, okay, so for sure, you know, but it's also to understand like what is the process of how our sages throughout the generations came to conclusions. So this is kind of like a short introduction. It's not like super long, but it's informative and it keeps us on the right track. Okay, so it says. Okay, so it says the introduction. All right, to the methodology of halakha. He said Judaism is unique in its teachings that study is not merely a means to an end.
Wow, I can't see your screen.
Oh yeah, yeah, you're right. Sorry about that. Uh, okay, all right. Okay, so it says like this. Introductory, right? Methodology of halakha. He says Judaism is unique in its teachings that study is not merely a means but an end. He said and not merely an end among ends, but the highest and noble of human aspirations. He says Torah study for its own sake is a sacramental act, the greatest of all mitzvahs. Throughout generations, Torah scholars were willing to live in poverty and deprive themselves in order to devote themselves to study. Every Jew, regardless of the degree of education, I'm sorry, erudition, I don't know. He has obtained whatever level he's attained. He devoted a portion of his time to Torah learning. He said those capable of doing so plummet to the depths of the Talmud. Others others pursued pursued the Mishnah or studies of the weekly Torah portion together with commentaries of Halachah. Even the unlettered reciting Psalms on a regular daily basis. To the Jew, Torah study has always been more than a ritual act. It has always been a religious experience. A Jew, a Jew has always perceived God speaking to him through the leaves of the Gemara and from the paragraphs of the Shulchan Aruch. The words of the words of the verses of the Bible. The sages long ago taught Kedusha Baruch Hu Amirahad. And God and the Torah are one. God and the Torah are one, and the Torah is a manifestation of God's wisdom. God reveals himself to anyone who immerses himself in the depths of Torah. The intensity of the revelation is direct proportion to the depth of penetration and perceptive of understanding. To the scholar, a novel illuminating insight affords um, a more convincing demonstration of the divine's presence than a multitude of philosophical arguments. It is a form of it's a form of divine confrontation which must be experienced in order to be understood. Yet it is a relationship which every Jew may experience, or at least they have these Hebrew words in English. So I'm like, what are they? Bezir Bezir Alpin. He says the masculine form through Torah study, the minuscule form through Torah study. I'm not exactly sure what that means. He says Judaism is a fundamental religion of law, a law which governs every facet of the human condition. The Torah contains not merely a set of laws, but can also canon its interpretations as well as principles according to which possibly internal conflicts may be resolved. Maimonides records the doctrine that the Torah will not be altered, neither in its entirety or in part, as one of the 13 principles of faith. He says the divine nature of the Torah scholars, the divine nature of the Torah renders it's immutable and hence not subject to amendment or modification. Although the Torah itself is immutable, the sages teach that the interpretations of many laws and regulations, is entirely within the providence of human intellect. The Torah is divine. Lo le ba shemayim he says, but it is not in heaven. And it says in Deuteronomy, he says, it is to be interpreted and applied by man. A remarkable corollary to the principle and of the immutability of the Torah is the principle that following the revelation at Sinai, no further heavenly clarification of doubt or resolution of ambiguity is possible. Clarification and indication are among themselves forms of change. He said clarification. He says, okay, so let's just go back because we're kind of like going through it. Okay, so he's stressing this point of he's showing us this relationship that the Jewish people have with the Torah. And now he's progressing that, and now he's talking about this idea of how the Torah itself, is not to be changed, not to be altered, right? And so it's immutable. It's not you can't change anything, right? So he's saying like this. He's saying clarify. So now he says a remarkable counter to the principle of immutability of the Torah is the principle that the following the revelation at Sinai, no further clarifications or doubt or resolutions of ambiguity is possible. All right. So whatever happened on Mount Sinai, that's it. Clarifications and indications are among themselves forms of change. Since there can be no new revelation, a prophet who claims the ability to resolve a dispute, a disputed legal point, by virtue of his prophecy, his prophetic power, stands convicted by his own mouth as a false prophet. Once revealed, the Torah does not remain in heavenly domain. Man is charged with its interpretation of the text, resolving the resolution of doubt and application of the provisions of the laws to be novel situations. He says in Gemara, Baba Metzia presents a vivid illustration of the principle of lo bal shemayim he in the narrative concerning the dispute between Rav Eliezer and the sages regarding a point of ritual law. Really, Rav Eliezer refused to be overridden by the view of the majority and went to great lengths by invoking heavenly signs to support his position. And Rav Eliezer had sufficient power to change the course of nature, to work miracles, and even to summon a heavenly voice in support of his position. But the sages quite correctly failed to be impressed. Interpretation of Halachah had been instructed to the human intellect, and accordingly, God's human intellect must precede its own. It must be preceded in its own dispassionate way, uninfluenced and unprojected by supernatural phenomena. So he's saying, like, he's bringing the story from the Gemara to emphasize, like, yes, the Torah comes from Shemaim, but the Torah is in this world. It's understood in this world, and it's to be understood through human intellect, right? And this application should be understood through human intellect. And he says, the human intellect must proceed its own disposition way, uninfluenced and unprojected by a supernatural phenomenon. So even though there could be huge things, all these signs and this, whatever, it doesn't change the reality of what we say in the ground, because we'll keep going. He says, even more dramatic is the narrative recorded in Baba Metzia. Here we are told of a converse between the heavenly academy and God himself, and with regards to a case of a possible ritual defilement. He says the God Almighty is cited as ruling that there is no cause for ritual defilement, while the heavenly academy ruled there was. The Gemara records that the matter was left for a final injunction by Rabbi Bar Nachmani. He says, who is a singular in his proficiency in such matters. Certainly, God did not need to be instructed in his laws by mortal men. The Gemara teaches that the law was designated to be understood and interpreted and translated by a man. Accordingly, man's understanding of the Torah must prevail. Man's interpretation is not only inherent to the content of revelation, but is one of which God Himself which one God Himself wills to prevail. Moreover, Jewish teaching recognizes the two conflicting conclusions may at times be derived from internal sources by different scholars. Who is correct? Both are correct. And these and those are the words of the living God, declared to the sages of Gittin. If two conflicting conclusions may be derived from the same corpus of law, then both must be inherently therein. And he says, the realm of theory, both are correct. Both are the Torah. Of course, the matter of practice in terms of Pesach Halachah is the definitive halakhic ruling. He said, and there must be a means of deciding between the conflicting views. Else, he says, else legal archery would be the result. To this in halakha, as a legal system, includes canons of Pesach, canons of judicial determination. He says, while these may produce decisions which are absolutely binding authority, this does not imply that the view which is set aside is thereby rejected uh, as a nullity. All right, all right. So just a little bit touch this whole thing. So the thing is like this. So the way God designed the world, and the way that God, according to our tradition, the way God designed the world, and the way that God brought this reality into existence, is that He wanted man to be able to, in essence, like let's go to this idea of, like, why did the soul come into this world? Right, the soul comes into this world connected to this desire to share, which is connected to Hashem. It comes into the body, and it instantly has this desire to receive. Now, in order for us to complete the mission, is to climb back to God, to recognize God through our own free will, right? And so the mechanism that we use to climb out of the desire to receive for oneself alone is this concept of the Torah, right? And then all the challenges that we face in life compel us to cling to the Torah and the laws and the spiritual system to climb out of these difficulties, because ultimately through that process we correct the soul. So these are the tools to correct the soul. So he's trying to explain how this mechanism of how God gave the Torah over to the Jewish people, to Israel, and he wanted us to toil and sift and struggle and to battle against ourselves to be able to do that, right? And so it's not about the heavenly voice. It's not about, other religions, oh, I saw a sign and this and blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, what does the halakha say? The world could be convinced you of all type of illusions. The Jews stood on Mount Sinai and they thought, Moshe was never coming back. And they built the Egel. So we can't use the physical experiences to justify this. And it's a very important point, even on leadership, is that it doesn't matter what's going on around you. It doesn't matter if a person, has a business and he wakes up and all of his accounts are frozen, 50 million, $30 million stole out of the bank. He has 250 employees he has to pay. He has kids. One of his kids had to go to the doctor. Everything's going crazy, right? Wife, this, the whole thing. He has to be so solid in his mind with his relationship with Hashem that while all that is going on, he knows that it's an illusion. And he knows that this is a moment that he has to go through. Is it a real experience? Yes. Are people affected? Yes. But who created it? Hashem created it, right? So when we talk about this idea of understanding this idea of the separation of God giving us the power in this world, gives us the ability to override the illusions that God creates to challenge us to grow, right? Okay, so that's where he's at with this. Okay, da, 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 da. Okay, he said, while these may produce decisions which are of absolute binding authority, this may not imply that the view which is set aside is thereby rejected in as a nullity. He says, on the contrary, as far as the study and the pursuit of Torah is concerned, such a view is of undiminished importance. No one has ever suggested that it is not necessary to recite Brachat HaTorah, the blessing pronounced prior to studying the Torah, before studying the words of Beit Shammai, on the ground that the normative decision is in accordance with Beit Hillel. He says, in the eyes of God, both are equally valid. He says so that's the thing. You hear Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel. There's certain rules that they have inside a Torah study, and so the idea, I guess, is that Beit Shammai is considered very like hardcore and very stark, and that's what we're going to follow in the times of Mashiach. And he says, now we follow the opinion, which is a little bit more, I guess, lenient, which is Beis Hillel, right? So he's making that point, and he's saying that no one separates the opinion because we hold by one person versus another. And he says, in fact, Hillel and Shammai are both right by God, even though we hold a certain way. He says, in the eyes of God, both are equally valid. The definitive Pesach Halachah is a matter of practical necessity, but not a reflection of a transcendental validity, right? He says. So he says. Furthermore, one should not, in any case, generate the impression that the subject considered of what is this word? You see this word? What is this? What is this? You see it?
Volitional.
Is that volitional?
Mm-hmm.
Volitional is like by volition, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, or volitional inclination that may never allow, consequently, to influence scholar's opinion. The Torah, he says, the Torah study requires first and foremost intellectually and honest. Beis Hillel did not purposely adopt a policy of permissiveness, and Beit Hillel did not a policy of stringentness, right? So, like he's saying, one didn't, they didn't choose that. He says Beit Hillel did not set out to be the ongoing, and the Beit Shammai to be the hard and unbudging. He said each reported sincerely held convictions, concluded to reach as in detached in dispassionate a manner as a humanly possible. He said, it is a travesty of the halakha process to begin with the preconceived conclusion and then attempt to justify it by the means of a halakhic dictate. He says neither Hillel or Shammai nor any of their spiritual heirs engaged in this was it sofer was this word sophistry? You see it?
So sophisticated. I guess it's saying like engaged in sophistication, but I haven't seen sophistry before. I've never seen that.
You guys, he's on that like high old English. Anyways, sophistry. He says in order to justify previously held viewpoints. All right, so that's an interesting point. Hmm. So that's a very interesting way. He said it's a travesty of halakhic process to begin with a preconceived idea. So they already have an idea and then attempt to justify it by the means of halakhic dictate. You know what's funny? That's the difference between the Orthodox and the conservative, right? Because the Orthodox, the Orthodox, like say for example, like say something like gay marriage, for example, right? So for Orthodoxy, someone says gay marriage is like absolutely not, right? Why? Because the Torah says, right? So, but the conservatives, and I've talked to a conservative rabbi about this. The conservatives were like, okay, well, gay marriage is an issue, right? Okay, so let's now go and try to find a way in the halakha to justify it. You see what I'm saying? So that's the opposite. We don't hold like that. We hold that no. Is that what does the Torah say? Okay, the Torah clearly says men and women can be there. So there's no need to go in. So he's saying this exact point. He's not talking about that issue, but he's just saying in general context, he says that it's a travesty. He said it's a travesty to begin the halakhic process, to begin with a preconceived conclusion and then attempt to justify it by the means of halakhic dictate. So that principle alone just will save a person's life, right? In their study Torah, in their growth or whatever, because there's a lot of perverted understandings of Judaism that exist in the world in Torah study, right? So this is like the truth of the truth, and this is the tradition. Okay, so he says neither Hillel or Shema, and keep in mind too, the Reform movement didn't start into the 1800s. Judaism is they were in diaspora for thousands of years prior to that, right? Like almost less than 2,000 years then, right? And so they just came up with this in the 1800s. And then out of that, and you know why Reform Judaism came in? Because they wanted to assimilate into German culture. And so the intellectuals at that time were hanging out with the European philosophers at that time. And so they said, hey, we need to reform Judaism so we could fit in with the non-Jews better. He said, it's our Judaism that's making it difficult for us to fit with the non-Jews. And then that's where the Reform movement came out of. And then out of reform movement, there are people say, well, the reform movement has gone too far, it's too this. So we're going to do the conservative movement. But it's still all on the same premise. We want to fit in, we want to do this, and then I'm going to find a way in the halakha to justify it. And that's what the Rabbi Bleich is warning us against. Okay. Okay. So he says, okay, so he says, and so he's saying that, when we talk about Hillel being stringent, I mean, Hillel being Mako being, I mean, that when we talk about Hillel being lenient and Shemai being stringent, right? What he's saying is that they didn't come in saying, "Hey, I want to find the most stringent approach," or "I'm going to find the most lenient approach." This is the conclusion that they came to through their study, and it just so happens to be that way. So no one goes into the Torah with a preconceived thing, like I'm going to use the halacha to justify this, or I'm going to use the halacha to express my personality, right? He's saying no. People through their study came to conclusions. That's the proper way. He says neither Hillel or Shammai or any of their heirs engage in their sophistic whatever in order to justify previously held viewpoints. He says the dialect of the halakha reasoning has been conducted in the spirit of let your law bore through the mountain. The law must be determined on its own merit, and let the chips fall where they may be. And he says these, and he says these are those of the words of the living God. It is a dictum applies only when fundamentally prerequisites have been met. Prerequisites have been met. All right, he says these are the words of the living God. It is a dictum applied when fundamental prerequisites have been met. He said the corpus of halakha must be mastered in its entirety and accepted in its entirety as the context of divine revelation. Canons of interpretations, which are themselves an integral part of Torah study, Torah itself, must be applied in the objective manner. Then and only then are the results conclusion the are the resolute conclusions the words of the living God. Then and only then may it be assumed that from the time of from the time of the giving of the Torah, it was destined that these conclusions be reached. It is conceivable that two different individuals of equal intelligence in Iduk possess an equal both possess an equal um, your mind's just going like in all these different places. So like simple that sincerity and objective sincerity and objectivity may be the antithetical conclusions. You may reach antithetical conclusions. He says since the Torah was given by God and disparate human and disparate human and disparate and and disparted human intellects were created by God in reference is virtually unescapable. That's an interesting idea. So it's like you think about it, so God creates the Torah, and then God creates the human intellect to comprehend it, right? So it's like a relationship between those. And he says it was a part of the divine scheme that both conclusions be reached. He says, since both conclusions are derived from the accepted premise and both are defended by cogent halakhic argumentations, it follows that both are limited expressions of halakha, legitimate expressions of halakha, and hence both equally valid or validity. Sorry. So let me understand what's being said here. Mm. All right, so he's trying to give us a process, right? Or he is giving us a process. All right, so he says the corpus of halakha must be mastered in its entirety and accepted in its entirety as the content of divine revelation. That's the approach, right? He said canons of interpretation, which themselves are integral part of Torah itself, must be applied in an objective manner. So a person's, interpretation, this, speaks for itself. He says, then and only then and then the results conclusions of the words of the living God, and only then can they be assumed. So you have to be objective when you approach the Torah, when you're trying to understand it. So he's giving us a simple step by step. Just kind of like take it in. And then and only then it may be assumed from the time of the giving of the Torah, it was destined for these conclusions to be reached. So he's saying at the end of the day, a person has to approach Torah study not from a place of egocentric of saying like, "Hey, I came up with this genius idea," but rather that this particular idea or insight that's coming right now has existed, was destined to be revealed, or has existed already, and I'm just saying something that was obvious to someone maybe even 1,000 years ago, right? Okay. No, no, no. Okay, it is conceivable that two different individuals of equal intelligence in education or whatever. I can't say it. I can't say it. So he says both possess an equal sincerity and objectively, and may reach antithetical conclusions. So that's very important. So there's two things, and there's a very big concept on that. And this is like, I don't want to go into a different thing, but there is a sefer that I have that talks about this idea of Rashi and Rashi's outlook, and he talks about the different outlooks at Rashi, how Rashi understands the prophets, how he understands, the sages, right? The different tribes, and he understands the personalities of Torah through. We talked about this before between Leah and Rachel, right? And they talk about Rachel. He brings Rabbi Sadok. It's a whole thing. But the point is just saying that he's making the point and saying that he says, one, a person has approached Torah with objectivity, right? Number two, he's saying that whatever insights or interpretation a person derives, he has to understand that this was already destined to be revealed, right? Or he has to understand or accept that it was a part of the creative thing, right? That it was going to happen regardless, and they're just a part of this long thing, and that's why I'm a big stresser of people learning how to learn Torah literature in general, which was a real big part of Or Sameach's, program was really opening up that door, right? Blessed memory, Rabbi Schiller. And so the thing is just saying that broad understanding, right? That broad understanding and that clarity, right? That comes that you're a part of Torah thought, right? And all these different brains are plugged into the central system, right? And have derived downloads from that. And so you're doing the same thing, right? You're part of all the millions of minds that have come over thousands of years, right? And those new minds were in essence, were in essence downloading, right? And so when we do the same thing, we're also downloading, right? And so this concept of downloading and mass downloading is basically the creative process that we want to be a part of, right? Because that's where the true reality is coming from. All right. So he's saying from there that two people can download two different things, right? From the same source, right? Because it's a central source, right? And so when we people come with different conclusions, right? He says, so since both conclusions are derived from accepted premises, and both are defended by coherent halakhic arguments, it follows that both are legitimate expressions of halakha, and hence both are are equal in validity. Of the insights obtained in this manner, the sages taught even that which a conscientious student will one day teach in the presence of his master was already told to Moses on Mount Sinai. He says, of course, the development of correctly formulating decisions formulated decisions governing matters of practice is of single importance. The methodology by which one's opinions are accepted and others included from application to the practice constitutes a highly complex aspect of halakha. Halakha decisions are not a matter of arbitrary choice. Decision making is also bound by rules of a process, right? And he says the judge. He said the verse judge. He said the verse judges and officers shall you make of yourself in all your gates, says in Deuteronomy. Bestow, he says, autonomous authorities upon halakhic judges in each location, locale. He says they all empower and promulgate their views in the area subjects to their to their area, right? Jurisdiction, right? And he says the local populace may with complete confidence accept the teachings. Whoa. He says it may accept with complete confidence the teachings of the local based din. So he's saying in order to have that clarity in communities, that's where this concept of the based in comes from, right? So every community would have access to these ruling decisions, right? That's the Jewish community. Okay. Thus, in the city in which Rav Eliezer was the chief authority, pronounced a populace, chopped trees, built a fire, and boiled water on Shabbat in preparation for a circumcision, while the neighboring towns such actions constitute a capital offense. Rav Eliezer's opinion to the effect that the Shabbat restrictions were suspended not only for circumcision itself, but even for preparation of the necessary accountments of the rite was authoritative and is in his jurisdiction. So he ruled a particular way in his particular town, and the town over it was blasphemous. The contradictory opinion of his colleagues was binding to their jurisdiction. Only upon the decision of the supreme halakhic authority, the Beis Din Agol, settling settling in Jerusalem, did did a given view become binded over all of Israel. He said the rabbinic authority may issue decisions in accordance with his own views when such views are not in conflict with the positions already binding upon the community of Israel as a whole. He may rely on his own opinion only if he has obtained the rescuous degree of Torah scholarship and education, and if the conclusion is genuinely arrived at on the basis of his own study and analysis. It goes without saying that his decisions are more authoritative. His decisions are authoritative only if his personal piety and religious probity are beyond question. He says frequently, however, rabbinic deciders is lacking in comprehension scholarship or has not formulated a strongly held opinion of his own. In such case, he must decide in accordance with of a number of views expressed by his proceedings, his predecessors, or colleagues. The ability to formulate definitive pasak is a product of a highly specialized skill. It is in choosing between conflicting uh, pre- uh, pre- presidents in the opinion that constant that con ugh, God, jeez, those words. All right, hold on, let me do this. Okay, so it says in choosing between conflicting presidents and opinions, he says that oh man, is this like the most simple word? I just can't say it right now. Consummate, and he says an expertise of the deciders become apparent. The deciders may not arbitrarily seize upon an individual's opinion or a solitary source to the negation of the weight of the halakha precedes or constitutes. He most certainly may not sway by the consideration that the result decision be popular or by the fact that it appeals to his own personal projection. This guy and his word uses, man. All right, so this is the thing. So he's basically saying like he's basically giving you the methodology of being a judge, right? And coming to conclusions inside of your community as a leader and what is the mechanism to do that. And he goes into the process of how the aspect of going in the halacha and this, and now he's dealing with the aspect of decision making, right? We're almost finished, right? And so he's going into that, and he's basically just saying, you gotta weigh these things, and if you are clear on something, yes, you can rule on it, and if there's not a general mechanism that all of Israel holds by, but different people, certain things are, there's certain collective things like fasting on the ninth of Av, you know what I mean, like these types of things that everybody agrees upon, right? So whatever. So that's the point. So he's going into that. He said he must be careful to weigh and balance his opinions and decisions. He says assigning weight not merely on the basis of sheer numbers, but also on the relative stature of the scholars whose opinions are under consideration, and must at all times assess the complexities and the relative importance of any number of component factors. He says, in order to understand the manner in which halakhic rulings are formulated, it is necessary to focus attention upon the deductive process by the means of which definite rulings are derived from fundamental principles. If the resolute halakhic decision is at times somewhat involved, it must be emphasized that only the means of halakhic dictate is it possible to appreciate the halakhic process as is employed in reaching a definite conclusion in the process of permanent sources. All right, hold on. We only got a couple more, and we're building up trepidation. It is possible to synthesize and compress complex decisions without sacrificing its accuracy. So he's asking a question. He's saying if you are using different sources to come to conclusions. So that's basically what he was saying the last time. He was saying that if there's a complex issue, right? If there's a complex issue and we need to find a ruling, he says we should learn out other cases, right? And from those other cases, those other chuvas and other things that have been written about this, we can build basically a hashkafa, an outlook on this particular issue. And we could derive from how we express ourselves, we would derive from these other works. And so now he's asking the question, he's saying, he said, is it possible to synapsize and to compress complex decisions without the sacrifice of accuracy? He says, is it possible to present? Is it possible to present the dialect of halakha in a foreign idiom without distortion? He says, however, from proliferation of both popular and scholarly works, there is a vernacular dealing with the matters of Jewish theology and practices, many of which unfortunately abound in misrepresentations and are decreasingly inaccurate. It becomes important that attempts be made accurately as a into I don't know of the view of normative Judaism. I think we just have two. Yeah, this is the last. This is the last one. All right, we made it through. We made it through. This is the last one. So what he's saying on this part that we just finished reading, it's just basically he's going through, and I spent a lot of time talking about these types of issues with Rabbi Demota, Rabbi Eliezer Demota, who is Av Beis Din, the head of the Beis Din of the Avadia Alliance. He's a professor at Antwerp University, anthropologist, expert on international law, Jewish Putins. But anyways, but he talks a lot about that. And he talks a lot about the halakhic process. And even when I was writing what I had to write for Tinuk Shanishba with the African American situation and the connection to the Ebos, right? And Rav Chaim Kanetsky and Chief Rabbi Pinchas and even Rabbi Demota, you know, um, he talks about this idea of being able to tell a story, make your argument all through the language of halakha and all on the backs of the sages, right? And other poskim, right? He says this work is not, he said, this work is not intended as introductory value to be a pursued by total. But I just like the more further we go in this thing, the more complex. He says intonatity. He says the present volume is too complex and too detailed to fulfill that function. He says neither is it intended to be an encyclopedia in nature. So what he's talking about is the work that we're going to be reading, because he wrote all these different things, one of which we started to read on preemptive war. So this is kind of like his introduction on his methodology, on his Masorah, on this, which is the same Masorah my rabbis have as well. So okay, so he says neither is it intended to be encyclopedia in nature or even in the treatment of any specific topic. He says nor is it intended to serve the practical halakhic guides, and indeed no attempt has been made to present definite Pesach Halakha. This work is devoted to an analysis of Halakha and halakhic reasoning to rather than to the formulation of a halakhic decision. As such, it is directed primarily to those who have at least some background in the study of rabbinical literature, but lack the requisite skills or leisure to assimilate and analyze the maze of responses pertain to the topic treated in this volume. It is intended as an invitation to the reader to join the noblest of Jewish activities and supreme joys of study of Torah. So it's very nice. So we're going to keep reading on that point. But anyways, any just thoughts? I mean, I know there's a lot of boom, 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 a lot of prior information structure, but you got it. You're in it. So with some thoughts on it.
I mean, it's really something that when I first started looking, studying Judaism, going to, Talmud, and obviously just reading the Talmud and then the Midrash, and I would see all these different opinions, and it used to throw me off. I'm like, hey, what? Like, what's going on? Like, why is there not just one definite answer? Like, why is there so many different opinions? Da da da. And then as I kept learning, I want to say it was somewhere in the Midrash. It might have been a Kumash. I'm not sure. But it was saying, a story that the rabbi just brought out of Moshe Rabbeinu and how, Hashem showed him all of the stages that were to come and all the, halakha that they would know. Like, I think he even showed him Rabbi Akiva. Like, there would be someone like named Rabbi Akiva who would gain so many insights on the crowns or the letters on the alphabet, Aleph, Bet. And I was like, wow, okay, it starts to make sense a little bit. Like, these aren't conflicting opinions. It's all, and you always see this is the word of the living God. I was like, how is it all one? But it's like, oh, it makes sense. It is all one. And how the rabbis breaking down how these different, opinions and how they form, they were given by Hashem. So you can get a different insight, a different look at 70 faces of the Torah, your Rav Zion say all the time, like the Torah is like an onion, you can peel it back and all those different things. So, um, going into the reasoning of how you make decisions, this is, I'm enjoying it because it's something that I'm not sure, what my destiny is within Judaism, but I'm very interested in being maybe a dayan, like a judge or something. So, I'm very interested in this, and it was a part in the beginning. I can't remember verbatim, but it kind of connected to what we were learning with Rabbi Sachs about, action and leadership. And even in here, we're saying like you have to act within the halakha. You have to go through the reasoning. You have to find. I need to go back and read it verbatim because it's a point I wanted to make with it. But it was something with action, and it connected back to what we were reading earlier, and I thought it was a powerful point.
So that definitely you're right on it with that leadership and everything else. And we just keep pushing forward. It's just a piece. So we'll be back on at 13. We're back on, and we'll probably go. I think we're going to continue on with Rabbi Sachs, and then probably a little bit about Pesach too. But yeah, that's pretty much it. All right, Baruch atah Adonai leolam amen ve'amen. Go to